talk this afternoon is going to be pure science, or are you going to touch
I'm
on
going to talk a little bit about engagement, just because I can't talk about issues around it.
Yeah. Well, I would imagine as these programs have been getting more and more successful, it probably is really getting harder for you to keep your science up.
It is, and I've had to consciously kind of figure out, you know, where does science fit in with public? Most people say, like, how do you fit in public engagement with science? But I still find there's so many questions I'm still interested in the field. So I have one in SF grant from the iOS program, sort of ecology iOS, with some ecophysiologists where we're looking at ecophysiology of canopy plants in the primary forest and isolated pasture trees. So I go down there twice a year and do field work and as a graduate student, Costa Rica. So that sort of keeps me in my science part happening.
Yeah.
But I think more and more of my time is spent now doing this, which is, that's fine.
Right.
It's just, it's interesting to observe how we all make different choices about where we end up going.
Yeah, definitely.
What
Well,
we end up doing.
I was telling you that my background is in immunology, but
Yeah.
I was very ready to leave the bench and just focus full time on science outreach. But then when I started working at that evolution center, working with all the evolution biologists, I sort of started to change the way I thought about it. I was like, if I had gotten a degree in ecology or evolution, I would have probably tried to balance the two more like you're doing.
Right.
I didn't want to be at the lab bench, but I could see myself trying to, if I were doing field work, to keep a part of that.
Yeah, and it's entirely possible to do it. I think before I got into all this public engagement stuff, I was purely just the science.
Yeah.
Established my career and got grants and wrote papers. So I don't think I could keep a balance unless I had done that really heavy duty science lesson first. And now I'm doing this. But it's funny now, I feel in some ways, I'm not quite in the public engagement world, just sort of, I'm not like you, or Susan, or the people, or Julie, or people like are really experts and really in that world. And I'm not, and I feel like I'm in ecology, but I'm sort of like, well, I haven't read the latest, what's coming up in the latest as far as the ecology management journal. So it's kind of I'm either in both worlds or I'm in neither one. But I'm okay with it. It's just like I had to make myself okay with it.
I sort of always felt the same actually, because I went from hard science to outreach and education, and the science community, like I told my department chair, they feel like I'm not a scientist.
I know.
And the education community works with me without any formal training in education, and they're like, I'm not an educator, you're a scientist. So I'm either both or not.
But I think there's going to be, I think there should be more and more people who like that. When I remember one of the, only got nothing I needed.
We did not make it.
Identified as science people. Here social science researcher. Here as a scientist. And it was like this mix, and a lot of people couldn't answer that question.
Yeah, I always feel like that.
I know. Yeah, so that's, it's like very funny. I'm good, I think I'm good.
And when we were doing the lunch set up like this. Yeah, sort of became kind of. I don't know.
Much more relaxed and like a doctor. We don't want them to go all the way out there and not see them. Jim did they were nice, but it's like weird getting you all here in a way that is over restrictive over schedule. It's not gonna happen. It was fine. Yeah. Good to see them. I was just saying I don't really understand because like 12 hours a year.
bit like the
Even green, sustainable
Yeah.
just got the invite for the random.
Yeah, not close to bad enough.
It's still weeks away, but people like aren't gonna be putting it on a calendar.
Remember, there's not a lot.
Yeah.
It's slow.
That's right.
People start.
We definitely have more people on speed than maybe some others.
Yeah.
Like 1 or 2 minutes.
Okay, good.
So you want to head up early tomorrow? I mean, this is a whirlwind.
I do. And it's really whirlwind.
You guys need help with something?
I'm surprised if you're a fan, but I'm surprised I didn't want to come with you on this one.
I know.
Sort of check out.
I know.
Hasn't been a while since. Oh, okay.
My table's up here. It's still there from Halloween. If you need tables,
Oh, so we
use
use
mine.
mine.
Yeah, okay, yeah.
Oh, okay. I know a few amp people.
Oh, you do?
Yeah, you know Rob Dunham? So he does amazing stuff. He does the state, and he's an amp, guy by background.
I'm sure Jack knows him. Yeah.
Probably, he's been become really involved in sort of public outreach.
I see.
So I'll send you a link.
Yeah, yeah.
Alright, there you go. Go ahead.
Okay, great.
Things were like, if you're going to ask, how was your day?
All right, folks, I'm gonna go ahead and get started. Everybody's ready, got their pizza, got their cheer wine. Can't get through a talk without cheer wine. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for being here. My name is Jory Weintraub. Some of you I know, some of you I recognize faces, and some of you are brand new. So it's good to have a mix of people here. I'm the Science Communication Director with the Duke Initiative for Science and Society, which is where you are right now. This corridor is Science and Society. We've just recently started this series, the SciComm Lunch and Learn series. It's something that we've talked about doing for a long time, but just never really had the bandwidth to do. And recently, I was very fortunate to have a new postdoc join our group, Ariana Ely. Some of you may know Ariana. And now that she's joined, and the SciComm group here is 2 people instead of 1, we're taking on some new tasks, and one of them was to start this Lunch and Learn series. So this is only the second one we've had. Was anybody at last month's Lunch and Learn when Ariana spoke? A couple of you, okay. So she spoke about her work in STEAM, science and art, and that was really cool. And this is the second event. The plan for these Lunch and Learns, just so you know, is that we'll do one each month during the academic year. We have one scheduled for next month and one for May, and then we'll take a break over the summer and then start up again in the fall. And the idea with these SciComm Lunch and Learn events was just to take on different, interesting, novel aspects of SciComm. So, if we have someone in town who's just doing awesome work and we can rope them into doing a session for us, then we try to do that. Next month's talk is going to be a guy named Dietram Scheufele. Some of you may be familiar with him. If you're one of my students, I have a few students in here, you've heard me talk about him. He's sort of the guru of the science of science communication. So he's going to be talking about the research in what makes science communication effective or ineffective. And then in May, we have someone coming. He's a CRISPR expert. He's at NC State University, but he's also been an expert witness in a bunch of science and technology related court trials. And so he's going to be talking about communicating science in the courtroom. And I think that'll be really interesting as well. But today we're really, really excited to have Dr. Nalini Nadkarni here. Sometimes things just happen in crazy ways. So about a month ago, I got an email from the person who had been lined up to do our March Lunch and Learn, and he turned out could not make it. He got asked to go to a meeting with his university president, which apparently he felt was more important than free pizza. Go figure. So he had to back out, and I was just thinking, great, what am I going to do now? How am I going to fill that slot? And I think within 24 hours, I got this email from Nalini who said, hey Jory, I'm gonna be at Duke, I'm gonna be in town, would you be interested in, meeting and chatting over coffee for an hour? And I said, I can do you one better, how about free pizza? And then I told her we were gonna put her to work for it, so, but we're really excited that she agreed to do this on fairly short notice. Her list of accomplishments is so long that I was gonna do it from memory, but I don't want to shortchange her. So she has a bachelor's degree from Brown University, a PhD from University of Washington College of Forest Resources. Her academic research includes community and ecosystem ecology of tropical and temperate rainforest canopies or forest canopies, the effects of forest fragmentation on biodiversity and community function, the development of database tools for canopy researchers, dissemination of research results to non-scientific audiences, and partnering of scientists and artists to enhance conservation of forests. And in her spare time, right, she does all of this great work. Actually, I first learned of her work with the Sustainability in Prisons project, which she's going to be talking about today, which has just been really, really groundbreaking work and broader impacts and outreach and reaching underserved audiences. Her list of grants and publications is longer than my dissertation, so I can't even read them all off to you, but suffice it to say she's gotten millions of grants and millions of publications, and the awards are even longer than that. So I will say that she's received awards for her work in ecology, conservation, education, public engagement, public service, and social justice, right? And save this coolest one for last. In 2014, Time magazine named her Nature Imagery in Prisons project, which I think you're going to talk a little bit about, as one of the best inventions of 2014. So very cool. So she's an inventor on top of everything else. So we are really delighted to have her here. I think you're going to love hearing about her work, and hopefully there will be time for questions at the end. So thank you, Nalini, for being here.
Thanks, Jory. That was a great intro. How many people, just to get a sense of this, of the people who are here, how many people are in science communication in the department, or science, sort of? How about the sciences? Okay, great. Anybody else? Great. Well, I sense there is, as I think there's getting to be more and more of, the sense of, well, I'm a scientist, but I do a lot of science communication, or I'm a science communicator, but I'm very interested, or I work with scientists. And so I think this sort of connection between science and communication is getting stronger and stronger. For myself, as someone who's deeply interested in trees and forests, I think I primarily identify myself as a scientist who studies forest canopies. I'll be giving a seminar today in the ecology group at 4 o'clock, so if you're interested in finding out more about science and what I've discovered in forest canopies, I'm happy to share that then. But what I'd like to share with you really today is more about engagement, public engagement, and I think this is a really great time for scientists who are interested in public engagement of their science, and also science communicators who want to help scientists do a better job of communicating. High-level science administrators like Franz Cordova, Alan Leshner are all saying, we scientists have to do more in the realm of public engagement. 2 years ago, there was a really vocal, very apparent outpouring of support for science in the March for Science that millions of people participated in. I think another indicator is actually kind of right here. There's evidence right here at Duke University. NABI has been established 4 years ago, the National Alliance for Broader Impacts, which includes public engagement. This is a research coordination network that is funded by National Science Foundation to try to develop tools and approaches and practices for scientists to carry out better, broader impacts. And here at Duke, you have your own Jory Weintraub, who's a very strong voice in that, and who is helping to move this effort by scientists and efforts by science communicators to push forward. So I think it's a really great time for you guys to be in this room and thinking and working and carrying out scholarship about public engagement of science. I thought I would present this talk in sort of 3 ways, 3 parts. One is just a little bit about my own story as a scientist who has moved more and more towards science engagement and the experiences I've had. Secondly, I want to provide you with with kind of the broad approach that I've taken with public engagement of scientists, that is trying to move beyond communicating my research to people who go to museums, who pick up National Geographics, and to try to get to more non-traditional public groups. And so I want to share with you some of the stories and ways that my students and colleagues and I have done that. And then thirdly, I'd like to take one piece of that work, and that is the work that I've done to bring science to the incarcerated, and tell you about that work in a little more detail. I want to mention that I have some handouts here if you're interested in picking up some background information. You're more than welcome to do that. So for many, many years, I've been climbing trees in tropical places like Monteverde, Costa Rica, answering curiosity-driven questions about how fast these plants grow, how they get pollinated, how they get dispersed, what their role is in ecosystem nutrient cycling. And as with many tropical biologists who started doing this work in the 1980s and 90s, I've become more and more aware of the negative effects of human disturbances. My beloved Monteverde tropical cloud forest looking more and more like this kind of land, and feeling that there's something that I, as a scientist, that I need to do something about this in terms of the kinds of ecological and environmental damage that human activities take. And so about, I guess, 15 years ago or so, sitting up in the top of one of my wonderful tropical rainforest tree canopies, I heard the sound of a chainsaw. And I felt like, wow, that chainsaw, literally and figuratively, metaphorically, is just outside the reserve where I work. And so that was really concurrent with this sort of general societal trend that I had been noting, and many others had been noting, about the increasing distance between nature and humans. Humans being more urbanized, becoming less and less connected directly to nature, which really supports us with the resources that it provides for all of a manner of things. And so I felt that I needed to do something, and I'm not good at talking to policymakers, and I'm not good at fundraising for conservation. So I thought, well, maybe what I can do is take the work that I do, which is kind of glamorous. I mean, small brown woman climbing into tropical cloud forest trees with ropes and mountain climbing things. That's kind of an easy sell. So I began thinking about ways I could do my own public engagement. I started a nonprofit in 1996 called the International Canopy Network, and the idea was to take scientifically sound information from the other canopy researchers and myself that we had created in the scientific literature, consult to places like National Geographic to make videos, write articles for natural history magazines like Smithsonian, kids magazines. We have a newsletter, we have a website, we have a social media communications. And I was very happy with that for a few years. I felt I was going above and beyond what most academics do. But I pretty soon realized that, in fact, the people who were reading the natural history magazines, the people who were going to watch National Geographic videos, were people who were already convinced that trees and nature were important. So I really felt like my efforts to do public engagement to save the rainforest was not going terribly far. And I began thinking really seriously of ways that I might be able to convince people who maybe live in an atmosphere or an environment like this, who don't have any contact with trees, who never climbed trees in their lives, might find some value of trees. And I thought that finding the connection between trees and people who might not already have a personal scientific, ecological sense, the values of trees from an ecological standpoint, how could I find values in common with those people in order to do more effective public engagement? And so just for example, coming on board here at Duke University, I know that there's this March Madness going on, and there are a lot of really passionate people who really care about the fact that Duke University is in one of the 4 #1 slots. So they're very passionate about basketball. And I am not passionate about that. I do not understand what this whole thing is about. However, I have learned that all of the hardwood basketball floors are made of sugar maple, hard maple. It's a dense wood with very, very thick fibers, which makes for the right kind of bounce when you play basketball. So for me, I have an interaction then with sports, not because who wins, Duke or UNC, but rather because of my interest in trees and the fact that they use hardwoods in a particular species. So actually, several years ago, recognizing the passion that people have for sports, and maybe that some of those people are not so passionate about science, I started a program at the University of Utah where I teach called Sports and Science. And there we tried to match scientists with sports figures, science, facts and figures, and understanding with making people be able to do better sports work. And we made a set of posters that had sort of the physics behind basketball. We made some videos that are now showed at halftime in our big stadium. So it's a way then of connecting what people are passionate about, that is who wins the basketball tournament, with some aspect of nature or science. we can think about this, and I've thought about this a lot with young girls, which I think is a very important audience for scientists to work with. You know, how do you get a young girl in New York City who never climbs a tree, who's never really had an interaction with trees as I did? That's where I got my childhood love of trees that has continued. How do we get her excited about trees and tree climbing and nature and becoming a scientist? And so my students and I invented Treetop Barbie. Mattel was not interested at the time in doing a Treetop Barbie for some reason, but we bought used Barbies from Goodwill stores. We had volunteer seamstresses make little outfits for her. We got helmets on eBay, and we made this little pamphlet about canopy plants of the Pacific Northwest, which we sent out with her. So she became kind of an ambassador for trees and forests and tree climbing to young girls. We did try ground support. He's such a good seller, so he's kind of off the books. But anyway, these two things, these ideas about linking the existing values of society with some aspect of trees or nature or science is really the sort of grand approach that I've taken in terms of the public engagement that I do. So we can think of this as sort of a tapestry with interwoven threads, these orange threads being the ecological values that I and my fellow natural historians and scientists have. And I'd like to tell you about some of the projects that we've done with the cross threads of the recreational values like sports or playing with Barbie dolls. And I'd like to talk to you about the programs very briefly that we've done in terms of weaving together the aesthetic values of trees and nature, the spiritual values of trees and nature, and finally the social justice values of trees and nature with this warp of the ecological values of trees and nature. So very briefly, just in terms of the aesthetic values of trees, one of the things that my students and I have done is carry out what I call Canopy Confluences. We bring together groups of people from wildly different disciplines. We bring in some forest ecologists, but also artists and musicians and creative writers and poets. We bring in modern dancers. We live together for a week in a remote forest area. I teach everybody how to climb trees with my mountain climbing techniques. And then I invite them to perceive and to communicate what they get out of being in the forest canopy using whatever tools they wish. So for example, our modern dancers who joined us on one of these confluences climbed up into the trees of a confluence we did in Costa Rica. She came back to New York City with her dance troupe. They created this wonderful modern dance called Biome, which we performed into dance audiences in San Francisco and Seattle. And so this then was the opportunity for Jody Lomas, the choreographer, to transmit the information, the senses, the sights, the sounds, the smells that she and her dancers perceived and presented to dance audiences, people who might not otherwise think about the tropical rainforest as a place to go for an academic lecture. So it reached a different audience. We also brought in a number of musicians and a wooden flute player, an oboist, a wooden guitar player up in the canopy, and also one of my students who's a rap singer, Duke Brady. And his rap songs were so intriguing, especially to the kids that when I would go to talk at primary and secondary schools, they always loved hearing the freestyle rap songs that Duke created. And so that inspired a program called Sound Science, in which we recruited 40 at-risk youth kids from Tacoma, Washington, to come to our forested campus. I hired a professional rap singer who went out with a biologist and these kids in the afternoon after taking a walk in the forest. We'd go to the studio, and the kids, with the help of the rap singer, then created a rap song of their own about their experience in the forest, and they created a CD which they then took back to their friends and family that then incorporated what they found culturally relevant and interesting to them, which was rap music and rubbing arms with a real rap music person, and incorporating that and blending that in then with the values of the forest that they encountered. I think fashion is another kind of application of aesthetics and of art. We wear clothes that sort of transmit not only beauty, but it also is a reflection of who we want to be. I mean, I wore this little black suit and my little, my nice shoes and pantyhose because I wanted to transmit to Jory and to you that I'm honored by this occasion to talk to you. So I noticed that not many of you are making the same message, but you're transmitting something of what you want to transmit to who you are through the fashion that you wear. So it seemed to me that this might be an opportunity using fashion that people recognize as some way of communication. If we could identify that with nature itself, that might be another way of transmitting the value of nature. So I've started working with fashion people in New York City at the Brooklyn Fashion and Design Accelerator to create a line of fashion that incorporates botanically correct images that has information about that plant's biology and conservation. So this is a way then of using the aesthetics and the meaning of fashion that many people understand to transmit how important nature is to us, that we should actually wear it on our clothing and transmit information. So for instance, this little scarf I'm wearing, this is the trembling aspen plant, Populus tremuloides, which is the state tree of Utah, which is my state tree. And it's very beautiful, but I also, if somebody says, Joy says, hey, I like your tie, I can start talking to him about sudden aspen decline, which is a result of climate change, and he can be informed about these kinds of things that are going on and affecting the tree landscape in which we live.
I still won't put on a tie though.
Okay, we'll work on that. So those were the aesthetic values. I also want to just mention some of the ways we've tried to connect the spiritual and religious values of trees and nature to faith-based groups, people who may or may not be concerned about the ecological values of trees. For my own background, I'm not a religious person myself, but I see and understand the power that religion has in our species. About 80% of people on planet Earth self-identify as people who believe in God in some way or another. So that's a lot of people, and I started just thinking about trees and religion, spirituality and religious symbols. And of course, when you open up the Old Testament, right away you get to know two very important trees, the tree of life and the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And I thought, well, maybe there are other references in the Bible and other groups, and I could use those references as my authorities, rather than trying to convince faith-based people using my authorities as a scientist, that is the journal Science or the journal Nature or climate change ecology. Why not go to the Bible and other holy texts, these texts that religious people already believe in, they already read and believe in. So what I did was I downloaded these texts from the web. I did a search for the words tree and forest in all of them, and I came up with a sermon that sort of compiled and synthesized all of these references to trees and forests, and then began knocking on doors of churches and synagogues and temples and offered to give this sermon about trees and spirituality, not as a religious person, but rather as a scientist who was so interested in knowing the values of trees and forests that she went to the religious authorities to learn about that. We also started mapping trees in churchyards. We made these little booklets that has biological information about the different trees of species in these churchyards, as well as religious texts that relate to the species of trees in their churchyards, trying to help people understand that the church space itself, the sacred ground that is preserved by those churches, contains the sacred objects, the Bible, the Talmud, and so forth, the Torah, but also the trees and the insects and the birds that occupy that space must also be sacred. So that's been a way that we've been able to relate to faith-based groups by using their religious texts. We've also been pleased to sort of join in on tree planting activities of the church, and church groups have come to our tree planting events. So it's been a way to connect academic and natural history and conservation groups with faith-based groups. So those are some of the recreational, the aesthetic, the religious values that we've been able to incorporate into our public engagement. And what I'd like to spend the next chunk of time talking to you about are some of the programs that we've been doing to link social justice values with ecology and nature. And this actually started with my trying to solve a purely ecological problem. In the Pacific Northwest, where I lived for 20 years, there's a practice of harvesting mosses from old growth forests of the Pacific Northwest. These mosses are used for the horticulture trade. When you go into a flower shop, you'll see mosses that are used to make arrangements and to put bulbs in and so forth. And although it's very nice to have these moss baskets, the practice of removing mosses from old growth forests is non-sustainable. Some of the basic ecological research I've done on mosses shows that it takes 3 to 4 decades for these mosses to grow back. So this is not a sustainable practice. And so I began ruminating once again, like, what can I as a forest ecologist do to reduce this practice? And clearly policing the national forests and national parks of the Pacific Northwest is not an option. And I thought, well, maybe if I could learn how to grow mosses, how to farm mosses, I could relieve that collecting from the wild. And so I didn't have graduate students at the time to work on this project, to work on moss horticulture, but I began thinking about who in our society might most want to work with mosses. well, it seemed to me people who are denied access to nature might find working with mosses really wonderful, really comforting, really positive. And who's kept away from nature in our society? The group that is most prominently kept away from nature are the incarcerated. People who are incarcerated for any amount of time really have no access to nature at all. They may be able to walk around their prison yard, but essentially they don't have access to nature. So I started knocking on the doors of state prison officials, showing them mosses, saying, I'd really love to partner with your inmates to see whether we could kind of crack how to, I didn't use the word crack, how to start growing mosses to relieve this ecological problems. And there might be some positive aspects in terms of your inmates learning job skills, having contact with living things. We know that calms people down. So this might be something very positive. So there was one prison superintendent at the Cedar Creek Correction Center. This is a tiny little men's minimum security prison about a half an hour from where I used to work at the Evergreen State College. He said, well, it can't hurt. Maybe it'll keep the guys busy, bring on the mosses. So we did. My students and I went out and collected bags of mosses. We brought them to the prison. We collaborated with the inmates to try to think about, now, how should we grow them? And we decided to grow them both in hanging bags, since they grow on trees, the hanging bags might be a good way to do it, or in these flats. And we set up racks where the men made them out of recycled wood. We taught them about random sampling and subsampling. Every month we would come back and they would sample these mosses. We would take them back to the college to dry them and weigh them. And within 18 months, we were able to publish a paper with one of the inmates as the first author on this paper about how to go about doing moss horticulture, something that had never been published before. It was a really successful story because I got my answers to my scientific questions. How do you grow mosses? Which species grow fastest? The inmates really loved it because they were interacting with my graduate students, they were interacting with me, they were doing something that was contributing, something positive, not only to society, but to the earth itself. And the superintendent liked it because the men were busy, they were doing better social interactions, there seemed to be fewer violent infractions. And so they said, well, are there other projects that you might bring in? And so I began a science lecture series where scientists would come in. These were basically, I would just invite my faculty colleagues and say, hey, you want to give a lecture about immunology to these inmates? And I would help make sure that the level of the lecture was at the right level, not too advanced and not too babyish. And that was very successful. The men loved coming to these lectures. We invited the staff as well. We had some sustainability experts, people who did things like gardening and beekeeping, and we had them give lectures, and pretty soon the men were saying, well, why can't we have an organic garden here at the prison? Why can't we do recycling? Why can't we start doing beekeeping? And so we were able to start an organic garden and beekeeping and recycling and water catchment, and a lot of these sustainable practices that actually began being of benefit to the prison itself. The recycling led to fewer trips to the landfill, which reduced energy costs to the prison itself. I also began making, so here are some of the lecture, just some of the topics that we carried out. As you can see, they're not, it wasn't like a coherent class, like let's start with bacteria and we'll end up at planet Earth. It was basically whatever informal science education the scientists, the faculty members, and graduate students wanted to present. So this is kind of different from offering a class in Bio 101. It doesn't bring any academic credit. We were able to give certificates if an inmate came to 3 or more lectures, but that was about the extent to which we formalized the education. But for that reason, this kind of education was really easy to do. I didn't have to go to my provost or my president and ask permission to get, to give academic credit from the university. These inmates didn't have to pay tuition, which is almost always a tremendous stumbling block in terms of higher education in prison. So this is one kind of science education that can go on, one kind of public engagement that can go on, and it's really truly a form of informal science education that can go on with a very low budget and a very small infrastructure. We also provided handouts. We would make 10-page handouts. We couldn't use staples. We had to use an unstapled stapler because we couldn't bring those staples into the prison. But these were always immediately snatched up by the inmates to share with their families during visiting hours, for them to learn more about the topic or to share with their cellmate. We also carried out evaluation of our lectures. So we would offer a pre and a post-lecture survey to the inmates as well as to the scientists. What we found was that in terms of percent of responses here on the y-axis, the questions that measured science content knowledge, that is, how many genes does a human being have? That would be an example of a lecture-specific science lecture, science content knowledge. That went up significantly. The attitude about science and scientists also went up, and the behavior about communicating science also went up. So that communication about behavior was, would you talk about this with your family? Would you talk about this with your cellmate? There was an increase in that as well. So we just published a paper in the journal Science Communication. This was a really difficult paper to publish. We went through 7 different journals. Even though we had a very large data set, the criminal justice literature or the journals said, well, this isn't really criminal justice. The science communication journal said, well, maybe, but is it formal education or is it informal education? So just to let you know, I'm not bragging about this, I'm just saying that when you try to do this different kind of public engagement, it doesn't fit nicely into certain categories that have been kind of established in the academic silos that we make out there. But it did get published, and so what we're hoping is that as people read that and see that science communication, science education, faculty and graduate students providing science lectures, such a simple thing as that, taking 2 hours of your time from your busy schedule to drive down to your local prison or jail, really does have an effect in terms of a population that is just literally the most needful and the most desirous of science education. We're hoping that by publishing this, we can increase this happening more and in more places in the future. This also led to an enthusiasm for conservation projects, and so I began linking in with some of my conservation biology colleagues. I linked in with Mark Hayes, who's a researcher with the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife, and they had an ongoing project of captive rearing of the Oregon spotted frog, which is a state endangered frog. Populations have gone down to just a few little populations in Southwest Washington. They collect the eggs of these frogs, they rear them in the laboratory, and then when they go through their tadpole and adult stages, they then release them to protected wetlands. So I went to Mark and I said, hey, you know, Mark, these guys did a great job with the mosses. They're really interested in science. Do you think that they could do some sort of citizen science work with you to raise some of your frogs in captivity? Literally in captivity. And so Mark was a little bit tenuous about, you know, giving these very precious eggs of this endangered species to inmates. But as it turned out, after he gave them training, he had 2 of these cattle ponds. He gave them 80 eggs to start out with. He trained them to, you know, how to feed them, how to care for them, how to look out for infections and so forth. They did a fabulous job. In fact, their frogs were larger and had a lower mortality rate of any other captive rearing facility in Washington state, and they won the Best Captive Rearing Facility Award 2 years in a row. So that made us realize that, in fact, collaborating with inmates is a really positive way to work with ongoing conservation and restoration ecology efforts. So we began other collaborations. One was with the Nature Conservancy of Washington state. They're doing a giant restoration project for the prairies, rare prairie plants in Washington state. We worked with horticulturists at the Nature Conservancy to come in and train inmates. We set up 300,000 plugs per year of 17 species of rare prairie plants, which now the inmates are creating and then the conservationists are then taking those plugs and outplanting them into areas of prairie that are undergoing ongoing restoration. We began working with the women inmates. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has a program to look at rearing the Taylor checker spot butterfly, which is a federally listed butterfly, and pollinates many of those rare prairie plants that I just talked about. So with the women, we trained them. We built a greenhouse actually at the women's prison. They learned how to take those eggs, rear them to caterpillars, and then into adult flying butterflies, which were then again released in protected areas. In Utah, where I moved almost 8 years ago, we've been working with the Salt Lake County Jail, the Draper State Prison, and 6 juvenile detention centers. And one of the conservation projects we've done is have the men build these nesting boxes for the American kestrel, which is actually a bird that's in decline across North America. We've been working with the BLM, the Bureau for Land Management, to grow plugged seedlings of locally sourced sagebrush to do restoration work for the sage grouse, which is one of our iconic birds in the Intermountain West. So what do the inmates get out of it? They learn scientific skills and approaches, the sort of day-to-day contact with scientists, with emerging scientists, especially graduate students who can share with them the scientific method, share with them the scientific way of thinking, but also listen to how inmates might think about problem solving in perhaps different ways than what scientists are brought up to think about has been really valuable. They learn teamwork, collaboration, social interactions, activities that are very rare in most prison situations where it's sort of every man and every woman for him or herself. It provides links to nature, and it gives them a sense of larger contributions. In fact, the Washington State Department of Corrections has now called this kind of work the opportunity to contribute, or OTC. And they actually prescribe it for different inmates. Well, that inmate needs 10 hours per week in the garden, 5 hours a week with the frogs, 10 hours a week with the plants. These are like OTC units, almost prescriptions. And on the other side of things, we have graduate and undergraduate students who are being trained. We've had a number of theses being written, independent learning contracts, and internships that have been provided. So there's been a benefit from the academic side as well as the prisoner side. All of this work has garnered a lot of really positive media attention. As you can imagine, when frogs are being raised by inmates and the inmates do that successfully, that's big news because people don't expect that of the incarcerated. And so there's been one of the benefits for the corrections institution has been positive media. Usually when you read about prisons in your newspaper, it's all about rapist escapes or how much money it costs per inmate per year for the state to pay. So this has really been a very positive thing for the media for the prison and corrections institutions. So this went on for, I guess, since 2003. This project has gone on very smoothly. And it wasn't just until, I don't know, the last 4 or 5 years that I began getting kind of feeling like, okay, we're doing a great job with public engagement with the incarcerated, but we're actually missing a segment of the prison population that probably needs access to nature the most. And those are the 100,000 men and women that are incarcerated in solitary confinement every year in our prison system. And people in solitary confinement live in these 9 by 12 foot cells for 23 hours a day. They don't have really any social interaction to make sense of, and they have no access, as you can see, to nature. And 1 hour a day, they're shackled and taken to an exercise room, which is a slightly larger room than this. They're allowed to walk around, there's a chin-up bar, and then they're escorted out after their hour of exercise back to their cell. And it was not possible for us with our program to bring nature lectures, science lectures, frogs, soil, plants, any of that stuff to these men and women because of the high levels of security. It's just impossible. But it still seemed that providing something that had to do with nature to these men and women would be beneficial. And we know from the hospital literature, the medical literature, that when patients get a view out a window to a tree or some aspect of nature, they actually recover faster than if they're looking out at a concrete wall. That's a very well-established phenomenon over the last 30 years. And the mechanism seems to be that when we see nature, or even images of nature, our levels of stress and anxiety are reduced, and that promotes physical healing as well as violent outbreaks. And so I thought, well, why not apply that to people who have the least access to nature of any other human beings on Earth? I mean, you could even do an experiment in which you denied access to nature to people as we have in solitary confinement cell blocks. And so after several years of sort of knocking on doors of supermax prisons, I was able to make a connection with a supermax prison in Eastern Oregon, the Snake River Correctional Institution, and they agreed to try it out. This idea of providing nature imagery to the men in solitary confinement cell blocks. So they assigned us a cell block that was sort of split in half. Each half has one exercise room. So on one part of the cell block, which had the same guards, the same control room, the same staff, and prisoners of equal risk, one of the cell blocks, one of the exercise rooms, we installed a projector and showed nature videos. And the other side, the exercise room, there were no videos at all. And so we ran these videos for a year. The men were allowed to choose a video if they wanted to. They didn't have to see a video, but when they were taken to their exercise room, they could choose to see a video, and they could choose one of 38 nature videos that we provided. And so they could pick a number. There was a list of them. They could pick a number, and while they were exercising or walking around, they could watch this nature video that was projected on one of the walls. And a year later, we came back and we carried out surveys of the inmates and of the staff. And what we found was that, in fact, these videos really did have a calming effect. Here we have the number of responses, self-reported inmate emotional responses. They felt the agree is the red and the blue is disagree. So they felt much more calm. They felt better sustained. When they were angry back in their cell block, they were able to remember the sense of being calm, and there was a positive staff relationship. So, meaning that the inmates responded that, oh, it seems like the staff are trying to help me out. So there was actually better inmate-staff connections than there were in the men that watched the videos versus those that didn't. But probably the most striking result was that we also added up all of the violent infractions, the what's called disciplinary referrals that occurred during that year. And we found that the men who watched the nature videos committed 26% fewer violent infractions than those on the other side of the cell block did not. So this then was a value, going back to that tapestry of values I showed you. Here's a value to the prison superintendents, to the prison staff, and the prison inmates of connecting those inmates to nature imagery. So this is something now that we're trying to understand better. We just got a grant from the National Geographic Society to measure the physiological responses, the stress responses in salivary cortisol and galvanic skin response when men watch videos and hear nature soundscapes. So we're trying to understand better which habitats are most calming, which sort of mode of delivery is best. Is it visual? Is it oral? And so that's sort of where we're going with this now. This practice has been expanded to 4 states across the country, and people or prison staff are finding similar kinds of positive responses as to what we did originally in Oregon. I want to say one more thing about the prison work, and that is I was just talking to Jory about this, that we tend to think about, oh, here's an intervention where we bring science education, science communication to an underserved audience. So what's the gain in terms of science knowledge content? What's the gain in terms of attitude? What's the gain in terms of behavior? But what I've learned over the years in listening to the scientists is that, in fact, there's a really positive effect of this interaction on the attitudes about the scientists. First of all, they're themselves as science communicators. Very often after a scientist goes to one of our prisons and gives a talk and comes back, we drive them to the prison and back, and they go, wow, I gave a talk then, and it seemed like the guys understood every word I said. I must be a good science communicator. You know, and for a lab scientist or a scientist who rarely talks to other people outside of the scientific sort of milieu, that's really quite a shift. But I think even more interesting are the comments that we've heard about social justice, about scientists becoming more aware of the system of mass incarceration that we have in this society, how ridiculous it is in many ways to lock people up in solitary confinement and expect their behavior to get better, to not have science educational, formal education programs. And so I'm beginning to think that this kind of program of bringing science by scientists to the incarcerated might be a mechanism for actually changing the way a very important, a very valued segment of society, that is the academics that are in our society, might have about social justice and mass incarceration. And these are just beginnings of ideas, but one of the things we're doing now is designing a retroactive survey for all of the scientists that have participated in our lecture series to find out whether they perceive that their experience in the prison or jail, short as it might have been, had any effect on their attitude about social justice and mass incarceration. So I think that this really is the framework that I'd like to sort of leave with you in terms of the approaches that I've taken. I'm trying now to think about how this might work at a larger scale. Because when I think about it, yeah, it's great, I went to 40 churches and gave 40 sermons, that's a good number of people, but that's really just a drop in the bucket. We probably have touched about 8,000 inmates with our science lectures, but compared to the 2.2 million incarcerated people in our country, that's really a tiny amount. And so I'm trying to think of ways that we might enlarge this idea of linking our values, that is ecological, scientific, and nature values, with aspects of society. And I think of the Trojan horse. All of you know the sort of myth or a legend or whatever, history, I guess, of when the Greeks were not able to get into the city of Troy. And so they very cleverly built this wooden horse, and Greek soldiers hid in the belly of that Trojan horse. It was taken in as a present triumphantly by the Trojans into their city. Of course, the Greeks came out at night and were able to open the city gates and destroy the city of Troy. But I think that idea of putting scientists into the belly of other vehicles that are already valued by society might be a way we could have sort of a bigger impact on science communication. And in some cases, with some of these projects, I just want to share you, this is actually happening. For instance, remember Treetop Barbie? Well, Mattel, when I called up 15 years ago and said, would you like Treetop Barbie? They laughed at me. They said, no, in fact, you can't sell your Treetop Barbies. But I just last year got a call from National Geographic, and they said, Nalini, and I work with National Geographic, we remember your Treetop Barbie thing, and we've made a deal with Mattel, and we're going to come out with 4 Explorer Barbies, and we'd like you to be the spokesperson for these Explorer Barbies. So they're making me a Treetop Barbie that actually looks like me. The other 3 are entomologist Barbie and astrophysicist Barbie and so forth. But I think this is actually, the idea of Treetop Barbie in the belly of the Trojan horse is now walking into Troy through the medium of this big commercial company of Mattel. And so this is an example then of how a small idea might turn into a bigger idea, but the timing has to be right. This is 15 years later. It's clear that there might be a market now of young girls who say, well, yeah, I want to be an entomologist, or I want to be an astrophysicist, and it's not so ridiculous anymore. So to me, this represents something very exciting and very wonderful, that society has actually changed to the extent where it's actually commercially positive to offer a scientist doll or an explorer doll associated with what was previously, the emblem, the icon of the opposite. As I mentioned, I've been working with fashionistas in New York City, in Brooklyn, New York, actually. There's a growing movement in the field of fashion, which I have always associated with overconsumption, with pollution, with terrible practices of making people buy more stuff and not being recyclable, or cotton that's been raised with herbicides and pesticides. But there's a whole growing arm of fashion I've learned that is actually all about sustainability. So they have welcomed me and my sort of crazy idea about scarves and aspen leaves to be a collaborator with them. In fact, I'm an academic fellow of this Brooklyn Fashion and Design Accelerator, because they are welcoming the input of ecologists to this process of fashion becoming more sustainable. In terms of religion and the connection of science, the AAAS, which represents the American Association for the Advancement of Science, they publish Science Magazine, Science Journal, they have started a new program about scientists and civil life, facilitating dialogue-based communication with faith-based groups. And they've started a number of conferences around the country. They're trying to train scientists to have conversations, to have dialogue with faith-based groups. They're also working with seminarians, with people who are training to be ministers, and providing them with scientifically sound information to include in their seminars, and really getting at the belly, again, the belly of the Trojan horse, going to the ministers, not having a guest lecture like me, a guest sermon from one scientist, but rather that these guys are getting trained to incorporate science in whatever way they see fit into their sermons. And finally, in terms of prisons, the National Institute of Corrections has recently released 2 really, to me, exciting publications about the greening of connections, trainings for prisoners to get involved with making solar panels for the solar industry, and recycling, and doing other kinds of sustainable work. But this is being published not by some tiny little group out of the Evergreen State College or the University of Utah, published in some obscure little science communication journal. This is actually being done by the National Institute of Corrections itself. So it's the institution that has incorporated some of these ideas. And I'm not saying this is just me or my students and me. This is, again, a changing environment that has sort of worked together to create something, I think, remarkable in terms of linking up the institution of mass incarceration training for making our world more sustainable. So I think that's exciting. I'm gonna just end here with just sort of a little pitch about a program that we started at the University of Utah 2.5 years ago that's funded by the Advancing Informal STEM Learning Group at National Science Foundation. It's a program that I developed with a number of other collaborators. Shelley Goldman at Stanford University, Dennis Schatz, whom you might know, who started Portal to the Public, and Becky Menlove at the Utah Museum of Natural History. And the idea is to train faculty and students in the sciences to carry out public engagement to non-traditional public audiences in venues of where they live and work and worship and play. Not in science museums, not in zoos, but rather in cooking classes or shooting ranges or churches or daycare centers, so that the scientist goes out to those people rather than asking those people to come to academics. So I think I'll stop there so that we have some time. If you're interested in more information about the STEM Ambassador Program, I can share that, and you can also feel free to pick up any of this material. So thanks for your attention.
So hopefully now you can all see why she is completely my science outreach hero and just an amazing inspiration to all of us. I've got about 1,000 questions, but I'm going to be good and I'm going to open it up to audience questions first.
Great.
So does anybody have any questions for Nalini?
And tell me your name when you...
Yeah, Ryan Huang. And my question for you is, so obviously there was a ton of like positive impacts with the incarceration projects, but if you were to give kind of your advice to people, looking to start more of these,
Yeah.
what was kind of the hardest thing about it? Because there's so many benefits. Was it the lack of equipment that we take for granted, like staples? Was it the attitude of superintendents? Was it the attitude of the inmates? What was the hardest part you had to kind of...
That's a really good question, and I'm happy to address that. I think the hardest part for me when I started it was making that first step inside a prison. And there were many, and I made this sound really smooth and easy, I have to say, but there were many times when I was rebuffed. It was like the superintendent saying, like, what are you doing here? This is a prison, this isn't a university. If you wanted to teach science, go back up there. But it took one superintendent to say, well, it can't hurt, it's not costing us anything. We need to accompany you with security, but that's about all it'll take. And very rapidly, they saw the benefits of it. And so after establishing that one prison, it was much easier then to go to a second prison, because Dan Pacholke, the superintendent, could call the other superintendent and say, this person's okay. This program seems to be working out. So overcoming that stuff, and now that this prison program is going on in probably 90 prisons across the country, there are lots of ways, if you wanted to start something here in Durham, that you could say, just go look at her website and you'll see a bunch of examples. And we publish it in corrections journals as well as science communication journals. Surprisingly, the attitude about the inmates was not a problem. When I first brought those first bags of mosses, I was like, oh my God, they're just gonna think I'm the stupidest, dumbest, most out of place, ridiculous college professor. What is she doing here? But it wasn't that. It was open arms. And I can tell you, and all of these, by the way, all of this work is voluntary. They are not required to go to these lectures. They are not required, but they are lined up. We have way more people who want to do work on our conservation projects than we have space for. The lectures are open. Men can go, we're not. But they're always respectful. We've never had an incident in the 15 years. They're always asking questions. They always want the handouts. There's always wanting more. So if you want to do this, do not think that inmates are a sullen, they may be out there, yes indeed, but even the men in solitary confinement, men who have been in solitary confinement for 7 years, think of that, being in that cell for 7 years, even they were so thankful, they were so grateful that they were going to be able to do something other than just their routine. So part of it is kind of maybe entertainment, but I don't care if it's entertainment. We'll take entertainment. So that was not a block. There are logistic aspects. There are prison lockdowns. We line up a scientist. Joy comes to give a talk about science communication. 10 minutes before his lecture, half an hour before his lecture, we get a call. Hey, we're on lockdown. So, so there's this uncontrolled aspect of it that we don't have control over. Unlike everything that goes on at the university, hey, yeah, lecture at 4 o'clock. The lecture's going to be at 4 o'clock. Not so with prisons. So there's a uncontrolled aspect of it that is difficult. And then we just have to get used to the rules and regulations. We have to get retrained every 6 months in terms of security. We can't use staples. We can't bring in pens. but we have to wear nice clothing, no cutoffs, I mean, we get a list of rules, but that's true of really any place that you might go in. This is a kind of a different list of rules, but that's mainly it. Let me mention one other aspect of this that has been difficult to deal with, and I'm not sure I've kind of worked it out. But that is that sometimes when we talk about our prison program, when we present to a group like this, we will get questions from people who are so against the system of mass incarceration, as I think they should be, that they are angry at us for making prison life better. They're saying, well, you're making it easier for prisoners, you're passing their time more easily. That means you're buying into the whole prison system. And I have to agree, I'm trying to make the life of individual prisoners better, that I might inspire them to get higher education when they might think about getting a STEM workforce job. But it has been viewed in the past by especially sort of prison abolitionist types that we are getting sucked into the system instead of trying to destroy it. And it's kind of a weird mindset for me, because I've always felt like this is a good thing we're doing. We're bringing education to people who need it. And yet it can be viewed in the opposite way. And so all I can say is, if it were up to me, I would abolish the mass incarceration system as they have in other places in the world, because this is clearly not working. It's inequitable, it's not fair, it's a waste of money and of human rights and human capital. But I can't change the system. What I can do as a science faculty, as a communicator, as someone who cares deeply about the environment and who cares deeply about people, this is what I can do. I can bring my fellow scientists to a prison, and I can maybe inspire some of them to do something with science, or to change their self-identity from saying, I'm stupid in science, to saying, I understood every word that scientist said, so I must be a potential science learner. Those are positive things that I can do. We've made some institutional changes. Now we get funds from NASA to bring NASA scientists to our prisons. So just last month, we had NASA scientists talking about astrobiology in prisons in Washington State, in Ohio, in Florida, and in Utah. These renowned NASA scientists talking to groups of inmates. That's an amazing thing, I think, and it wouldn't have happened if we hadn't done this work. So I think, a more subtle problem, I wouldn't say it's a problem, but it's a consideration, is that in the desire to provide opportunities in a place where opportunities are not, we may incur some of that injustice might kind of rub off on us. And I think each person who's involved with this project has had to deal with that, think about it, and come to some sort of an understanding and peace about that. Keeping ears open as to how far do we go, but being aware that thread of maybe this isn't the right thing to do, it has to be. And those things, this applies not just to prisons. I think whenever we do our science communication work, we have to think about, what is the impact on this? What does it mean to bring science to this particular audience or this place? And these are, maybe we bring in ethicists to think about this. But ultimately, I think each person has to decide for him or herself where we go, what we do, and what it means.
I know you have a question, but I want to jump in because I have something that follows up on that perfectly, which is, I do workshops at universities all around the country about how scientists can do outreach around their research and how they can engage the public. And every time I do one of those workshops, I spend a lot of time talking about Nalini's work in the prisons as a perfect example of really impactful ways to do it. And a couple times now, I've had comments from professors who've said, well, in this state, if we were doing that, people would complain that we're making things too easy on the prisoners, and the public wouldn't support the work we're doing because they think prisoners should suffer. Right. So that's sort of the opposite. That's another aspect. Well, that's sort of the opposite, but it's another criticism. And one of the things that I've had to do, I started this program in Washington State, very liberal state. Sustainability is like the buzzword of the day. Went to Utah. Sustainability is, I was told, do not use the word sustainability when you go to talk to the prison superintendent, because we're an oil state, we're natural gas, we're an energy extractive state. So sustainability is not a good word. But education is a good word in Utah. So, but I have learned that, I have not asked Draper State Prison for any money for this. They would not, so we're just totally doing this sort of under the radar. The Salt Lake County Jail, on the other hand, which is run by the city and the county, much more liberal,
they're much more out there open. We've had great media. They're very happy to share things with us. They've given us tremendous support. And the Juvenile Justice Service, which is far more liberal, has actually given us $150,000 a year to bring these lectures and conservation projects to their youth at risk. So I think you're right. And at the university, I have not been able to get credit-bearing courses out of the university. They do not want to be identified as an entity, an academic entity funded by the state that is giving free lectures by university faculty and graduate students. They haven't stopped me, but they do not broadcast it out. And so I've learned that in different ways in different places, you have to sort of, get it into the belly of the Trojan horse in different ways. And by just, saying, but this is right, University of Utah should sponsor this, I would get nowhere. So I've learned to temper what I do to suit kind of the situation that I view as needed. But that's a really good point.
Casey, you have a question?
Yeah, have you gotten any feedback from prisoners who were, say, a part of one of your programs and have since been released about, what they're doing now, how that program influenced them, and whether or not it helped ease their transition back into society?
That's a great question. One of the things we would love to do, and this will have to be done in collaboration with social scientists, is to follow these men and women out and to see whether this has had any impact. It's really difficult to do that. Just once they're off parole, there's no responsibility to communicate with them. So the only feedback we get are people who get back to us voluntarily, which of course are the ones who have met with some success. So I can tell you anecdotally, yes, we've had a number of that sort of feedback. In fact, Craig Ulrich, who was the guy who was the primary author on that paper that I showed you, he then went on to graduate school in ecology. He then went to get a postdoc at UC San Francisco, and now he's on the faculty at the University of Nevada in Los Angeles in molecular biology. And he said his interest started when he was working with a decomposition project we were doing. We were making a compost project for the gardens, and he said, I want to do a project. So I gave him a thermometer and a notebook, and a pencil, and I said, well, why don't you record the temperature of this and just do a really thorough job. So that's where we began doing this manuscript. You were asking about this, and there's no internet, so I couldn't just send him a draft and he'd send it back. So I'd have to print it out, drive it to the superintendent who would then give it to him and back and forth. But he got really excited about science, and he went on to now really contribute to the field of science, and we're all really proud of him. After he got out, I asked him if he wanted to give a talk at the Ecological Society of America meeting, and he did. And he had to get permission from his parole officer, but he did it. So at the ESA meeting, it was a symposium. There were 200 people, ecologists in the audience. His parents were there from Alaska. They flew in for this. He got up to the podium and he said, I went in a prisoner and I came out a scientist. Like, everybody in the room just started crying because it was really a beautiful transformation. And not everybody is a Craig Ulrich, obviously. And we can't count on that. And I don't count on it. I think if there's one Craig Ulrich, great. But if there are 50 people who just go, I understood that lecture, maybe I can understand more. Or that scientist seemed like a regular person. Or if the scientist says that inmate seems like a regular person, I say we've had a success during that lecture.
So unfortunately, we are out of time. I could go on all day asking you questions about your wonderful work, but I just want to thank you again so much for taking the time to share this with us. For all of you out there, especially those of you that are studying science and are going to hopefully become scientists someday, hopefully Nalini is just a great inspiration for how you can both be a successful scientist and do amazing work with outreach. I think if any of us had even one of her ideas, we'd feel like we were successful in outreach, and she's had dozens of them. So, but please join me in thanking her for this wonderful presentation. And there's information up here if you want to come take a look. And I assume if there's more pizza, please help yourself, eat as much as you want. And keep coming back to these lunch and learns. We love having you, and we're going to have some good ones coming up. So thanks everyone for coming.
Sure, do you know the date is of the next one?
The next one, Dietram Scheufele is talking April 18th. I think we've shut down RSVPs because it's full. And then the one after that, I think is going to be May 10th. But if you're interested, just sign up for the science and do